Welcome, everyone. We're so excited you're joining us for our Hill Country Brown Bag. And we're extra excited because we have with us today Amanda Ellis. She is a partner at, I won't get it right, so I'm just going to read it. Dalrymple, Shellhorse, Ellis and Associates. I probably butchered that, didn't I? Yes. But Amanda, this is her 4th year in joining us to start our new year off right on the right ethical foot, I would say, and get us going. So I'm going to turn it over to her real quick. We're just so grateful to have Amanda because Amanda is always prepared and letting us know what's coming down the pipe ahead of time and helping us to be prepared ethically so we can do the work in supporting our clients and the things that we really love. So we love our partnership with you, Amanda, and we're grateful for it.
I'm the same way. I love, as I tell y'all repeatedly, I cannot do what you do, but I have a lot of respect and grateful for the opportunity to support your practice.
Well, before I do turn it over to you, Brian did ask me to remind everybody, questions, comments, please, 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 we invite those. Put those in the chat, and then we will get to those. So please don't hesitate to do that as Amanda presents.
Awesome. And please do, as you know, today I am an attorney, but I am not your attorney today. For this first hour, we're just trying to field some things that I can hopefully give you a heads up of what's coming. Some recent rule changes and maybe kind of deciphering what they mean for you. Because I know there's we have the benefit of having so much information out there that sometimes we have too much information and don't have a really good ability to independently verify that. So one of the things that I really try to focus my work on now, we were talking about this earlier, I do try to deliver content, but I also want to make sense of some things and take out some of the legalese. Sometimes we have some misinformation or strong opinions within the profession that come from codes of ethics or associational rules, or quite frankly, this is the way it ought to be. And versus, well, let me tell you what the rules actually say, what the laws actually are, and then what your options are as an independent practitioner in terms of ethically what you feel good with. And sometimes it has to do with your risk aversion, how much you want to live on the edge there when we've got a rule, which we'll talk about some of these federal regulations that have come up that you all now have to comply with, about which way you're going to lean in order to best serve your clients, but also not be, for me, it's 2 a.m. when the squirrels run and, you're afraid of the end of the world coming then over what you've done wrong or you haven't done right or you've forgotten to do or what you said. So with that, just a little bit about my background, since we have community members. I started off working for the Attorney General's office, and so I used to be the attorney for a number of different agencies, not unlike the Texas Behavioral Health Executive Council. That, has only been around for a few years, so that was before my time. So I had that background and benefit of how do you make rules and how do you enforce them and how does government work in that respect. So now that informs what I do on the other side. Also, it's a real kind of fishbowl of what we call administrative lawyers. So I have a lot of friends that work for agencies or left agencies and work in private practice and go back and forth. And so that helps me understand how to help you all comply with your rules and avoid complaints, because that's what we all want to do, right? I'm also always amazed that you all don't have more complaints because you deal with people dealing with their worst. And it's free to complain. Now you can email it, you can go online, you can call, you can fax. And so we want to talk about what we can do. You can't control for it, but what we can do to avoid that when as much as is possible. So step one, the first thing I would do is arm yourself with knowledge about your rules. Last time I was here, we went online and we looked at things with the Texas Behavioral Health Executive Council website. And even though you may go there and still go, yeah, this is not still feeling user-friendly, warm and fuzzy, it has gone miles beyond where it is. And you really can get on and go to your individual board and go under board news and see what's new, what's changed, what's been done. We've had a lot of big rule changes at the speed of light since Texas Behavioral Health Executive Council came about. And one of the most recent meetings for the LPC board had to do with, hey, we've heard you all. We hear constantly complaints about there are too many rules and they're changing too fast, and we can't keep up with them, and we don't know what the changes are. And then we've got supervisees, and we've got to try to teach them. And they've come up in a completely different environment when we've got an entire generation who is like normal, and the use of technology is whatever, and most of them have not done their supervision or had their experiences in person, or quite frankly had the benefit of four walls to create the boundary that needs to happen. So you all have to do an extra job of trying to help these supervisees. It's almost like you need to create those walls for them to understand how not to blur those lines. So when we look at the rules that are coming, one of the things that the LPC board decided to do.
Sorry, we're having a little technical issue.
Small technical. Okay, let's try it there. It may be that somebody's not muted.
Everybody, I can't reach the down button because it's like in the.
Okay, I'm going to soldier on. So one of the things that they've done with the LPC board just recently is they've decided to, with the rules committee, and we'll talk about other licensures. All of the boards, the council's been trying to get everybody on the same page to the extent that they can. For example, did everybody hear about all of the continuing education requirements? So do you remember when you used to get CE and it had to come from an approved provider, and it was a big hairy deal, and you had to submit it to the board, and the board had to approve it, and then and only then could it be count. And then along about the time the Texas Behavioral Health Executive Council came along, then we just threw all that out and there were no rules. So anybody could do anything and it all counted, right? You didn't have to worry about the association. You didn't have to wait and jump through the hoops to go through whatever local, regional, institutional, nonprofit org, whatever, to do that. Well, pendulum swing. So recently, over the past year and a half, there was a big hoo-ha. There's lots of drama about doing that, right? Because on the one, you've got some concerns about quality. You want to make sure that you've got good quality, accurate, clinically, ethically, legally, and a lot of the associations and a couple of people who are in business of being CE providers, particularly interested in that. And so what they did is they reached a compromise. And so now, just so you know, because I get questions about this all the time, 50% of your hours need to come from something that's approved by an organization or an institution, or your regional association or your state association or your national association, or there's a whole list. It can be done by an academic institution, a governmental entity, and then this is the little compromise one. The little compromise one says one that is done by an LPC or LMFT or licensed clinical social work or psychology supervisor, or someone who has been approved by them. So now that's kind of almost created another little organization. So I do know that I have a lot of practices that then designate somebody as the supervisor within the practice or within the organization to be the one to approve whoever the speaker is that would come in. Sometimes that's how that works for me. I say that because I get a lot of misinformation, because people are like, oh, well, I can only do 50% and I've got to do here. I go, no, that's what the division is. So it's not as, it's doable. It's not as big a bar, but I think there's just been a lot of, what can I do and where can I do my CEs and what can I not do? And that rule is a good example of where they've tried to, for the first time ever, make things consistent between and among the different boards. So now all 4 licensees under BHAC have the same continuing education thing for the most part. 50% has to come from these. And you'll see they've mirrored the rules. You'll see the same language in all 4 places if you go and look at things. And that kind of helps. If your folks, Brian, you've got LMFT and LPC, if you've got more than one licensure, sometimes that's been tricky. The other big trend that we've seen this year, LPC just met in October, and they're to remove the last, is taking away the expiration on the licensing exam. You may have come up across this, particularly when people have, maybe they didn't follow through and get their license right away after school. Life happened, moves, illnesses, family, changes, births, deaths, pick a thing. And so for that reason, they get going, but they don't finish their 5 years, their supervision within that time. And then the NCE exam expires. And then they've got to, I don't know if any of you ever want to go and do that again 5 years later. I mean, I don't, if I had to sit for the bar again, I'd be a barista now. I mean, that's not happening. I'm not. So one of the things they did is they want to remove that. All the other licenses had done that. LMFD and psychology had done it, I think, most recently. And so LPC has just removed that. And it doesn't impact a huge amount, but it's all this trend of how do we have more providers, create more accessibility in a wave since COVID of really people seeking mental health services. I mean, it doesn't eliminate the stigma altogether, but it's made some great progress in that direction. So that's another trend that they're having. I anticipate that coming up this year, for example, at all of the boards, and particularly just recently with the LPC board, they've decided, okay, we're going to look at our rules and we're going to try to make changes all at one time instead of trickling them out throughout the course of the year. Now, they have a big daunting task, which all the agencies have to do. There's every 4 years. You have to do this big 4-year rule review. So there's a big committee of them that are all going to read every single word, sentence, just overview everything. And it's a good idea. It's like you go back and you go, okay, what makes sense now? What doesn't make sense anymore? What's not serving us? And so they're going to do all that. And then when they do, if they've got any changes to roll out, they're all going to come together. So I do encourage you, get on YouTube, watch those meetings. You learn so much about how they do things and why they do them and what they're thinking about. And they invite everybody, students, supervisees, everyone, get online and submit your comments or your questions about whatever the proposed rule change is. What do you think about it? What do you not think about it? And so they're going to be doing that big cleanup. One of the things they did just do in 23, just so you know, those of you that have supervisees or people that are trying to take the jurisprudence exam, they did kind of a big reorg, and it needed to happen. But what it did is it messed up all the numbers. So, for example, they moved all of the continuing education stuff into one place, and they moved all the stuff that had to do with boundaries and conflicts of interest, and they kind of moved it and they renumbered it. And when they did some of those things, now the jurisprudence, they had to revise all the jurisprudence because some of the stuff was wrong and it wasn't there. Oh, which, by the way, for LPCs, there's always kind of been limitations on boundaries with clients and personal relationships, non-therapeutic, romantic, etc. And psychology has always had a 2-year limit. Social work has been just don't. It's LPC's been kind of like don't do anything. But no, now we have some hard rules. I mean, no non-therapeutic relationships in less than 2 years after the end of therapy. No romantic relationships less than 5 years. Also, don't get involved with family, friends, etc. thereof. I say this because the reason that we have to keep having these rules and we keep having to set these guidelines is we keep blurring them. And sometimes I am facetious. I'll say pretty much at every one, don't sleep with your clients. Please don't. Please no romantic relationships. Please no friendships. Please don't go to lunch. Please don't go to coffee. But you would be amazed how those boundaries, or maybe you wouldn't. Technology really has continued. This has not stopped. It has continued without having four walls and the ability for clients and parents of clients to reach out and text in between, around, and among, typically related to crises. Particularly, I see you all get sucked in, and I understand when there's concerns about the safety or how a child is doing in the home. Then add a layer of litigation, add some CPS reporting that's going on. But we're seeing those boundaries. It's a slow boil that really does result from the communications that you have between, around, and among, not necessarily during your sessions, and that your supervisees have. And I would really, I find if you don't ask them really explicitly, really expressly, and you may be meeting with folks and going through cases and everything else, and then after the fact discover that they were texting all the time with a client or with a client's parent, and they were having this kind of, and if you saw the level of conversation, you'd be like, oh, that's a lot, or that's not, we've broached what should be or remain therapeutic. And a lot of times it's not it's really a lack of awareness. It's like, well, yeah, of course I was, they were in crisis and they needed this, and so just, and with each other, help each other, because it's really easy for that to transpire.
So the question is, why did LPC change it to 2 years, but 5 years for romantic? Like what?
So 2 years is non-therapeutic. So non-therapeutic might end up being, and keep in mind, we're looking geography-wise. If we're in small towns, if we're in rural, if we're in smaller communities, church communities, different ability communities, we find that they have to find something that is a limitation, but that is also reasonable. And so it's kind of like, well, how did we land on 2? Well, we just kind of tried to figure out what made sense. So then non-therapeutic might be that you are working with them to teach a class, participate in a program within church that you might have not been participatory together, for example, within the 2 years as a client. Okay. And we try to avoid where we can, but that's where they landed. You can see the meetings within 2023. There are several dates that you can go back and you can hear the conversations that were had that led to them arriving at 2. And you can also look through the website at the preamble and it'll explain why they picked. But I would listen to the meeting. I think that's a great question. And again, why did we land at 5? I'm going to say just don't. And I'm just going to, there's no time limit that's really ever going to be okay for me. But that's, I'm thinking from lawyer brain. I'm trying to protect you all. You tell me if that's different. Any other questions, Brian? Anything coming up on this? Okay. But yeah, ask people, hey, are you texting with? Because I know that text it's never going away, and that we're going to do it securely, and that we need it for scheduling, and that people need to get a hold of us. But I'm still a big fan of the portal. In the years since I started doing this, when the only tele we were really doing was by phone and by email. Portals were a little cost prohibitive. We hadn't automated everything. We didn't have Simple Practice Therapy Notes Therapists. We didn't have all the different companies making it very easy to be in solo practice. But now you really don't have an excuse for not having, first of all, secure communications at a bare minimum. But second of all, let the portal be your 4 walls when you can. Because ordinarily, otherwise, you wouldn't have these in-between therapy interactions. And so I know I've talked about that before, but as it continues to be an issue, I'll keep talking about it. I don't know where we will see the rules in 24 land with respect to the questions I continue to get about telehealth and crossing state lines. Okay. I do know as of the last LMFT meeting, One of the things they're contemplating doing is what the psychologists do already, and that's a 15-day to 30-day, they're contemplating what it will be, temporary registration. So somebody could be in Texas temporarily and not have a Texas license, but be able to offer some services to somebody that's remote. They had big discussions about that because we have the scenarios where you see somebody who goes off to college, you see somebody who is deployed, you see somebody who is gone for mission work. They're in these scenarios, but they want to keep their therapy going. It's a temporary absence. What do we do? All of the jurisdictions have pretty much said, and Texas says the same thing. If you're in Texas, then you need to have a Texas license. If you're not in Texas, go check with the jurisdiction of wherever your person's going to be. Increasingly, they're trying to figure out some way to do that, but they're also concerned about burdening the council. How much burden is that going to add if you've got to police people who have these temporary registrations? So we still don't have a perfect solution unless and until we have true compact between and among everybody for all things. And so that's still, but people keep trying to make rules about that. The other thing that I think all of the boards will keep trying to make a rule about, and until we get a legislative change, I don't know what we're going to be able to do with the notion of coaching, or you can call it a whole bunch of different things. But what do we do when we have something that doesn't necessarily require a license, or where our licensees want to do something else that is not counseling, but they have a degree? How do they do that? There's a lot of great, I know I've got a practice client, and they do a lot of marriage enrichment training. You come for a weekend or a week, you leave and you want to do follow-up. People have come in from out of state. Well, to what degree is that therapy or not? If it's not, but I have a license, can I do that piece without having to worry about all the things that my licensure requires? We're still, nobody likes it. No board member likes the idea of coaching. Everybody wants people to be educated, have an appropriate license, have the expertise, have the skills to do what they're doing. And it just burns anybody that there's somebody running around out there doing it with none of that. But we just have to have some kind of legislative action to police that before the council can do anything related to that.
So
Yes.
That's the counseling compact. There's a question about any updates on the counseling compact, and that's contingent on the legislature actually doing something.
And that's where we are. A lot of times, that's another question. Like, the council will get inundated with questions about the compact, literally waiting on the legislative change that has to be, each legislature has to adopt what they call the enabling statute that then permits that to happen, and then that can go. So that's what we're waiting on.
So one of my questions was about the coaching, because I see so many counselors doing both, and it feels very sticky.
Mm-hmm. It is.
And so I feel like you've spoke to that before, but I kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on that again. As a counselor, like, that feels like you're stepping in. I don't know how I would coach and not use my counseling skills.
Well, that's the big debate. I've talked to a number of folks. I've talked to agency staff. I've talked to people, colleagues. I've talked to everybody that's out there. And where things lie on the spectrum of opinion really has to do with that thing I talked about, risk aversion. On the one hand, you have a number of folks that say you can't ever take off the hat. If you've got your licensure, you're always practicing. And so for a number of folks, you can't do it. If you're going to coach, it's really all within the auspices of the practice of whatever your license is. And therefore, they may do a parent training course, have a couple go through a workbook, do some things, but then they just do it exactly like they would do license practice, complete with your informed consent, notice privacy practices, GFE, all of the things that you would do to set up, and then records are kept as treatment records in the electronic health record. Okay, and that is one way of looking at it. There's another school of thought that is, well, we all do lots of other things. Just because you are a licensed professional counselor, a licensed marriage and family therapist, everything you do isn't the practice of licensing. So, people go, well, what if I wanted to sell vitamins? If I'm selling vitamins to people, well, that's not practicing LMFT. Well, okay, well, I can do that. There are some things that we can see as distinctly separate businesses. But what if I have a licensee, and the licensee also wants to do a business that is nutrition and wellness? They really believe that's a huge component to mental health. And so separately, they want to work with a company that does one-on-one coaching. You check in about your nutrition, your activity. There are group activities where they get together for hikes or runs, or, well, is that going to be considered licensed practice? If I do that, because if it is, well, I can't go to lunch and I can't have a pizza party and I can't go on a hike and I can't do things with my clients, or I should not. So now what is that? And I will tell you, I try to talk to folks about all of those things. The reality is, as long as you have a license, you may always be at risk of someone filing a complaint. And then it is up for the council to decide, does the activity, does this fall within the jurisdiction of the regulation of your practice, or was this something separate? And we know that these cases are coming, and that we're having them as more and more practitioners have gotten into business for themselves. I mean, this is the greatest number of self-employed private practice practitioners that we've ever seen. That was the proliferation. I mean, you have more people who get out of school and go straight into business for themselves. We now have associates who may be independent practitioners, LMFT, psychology, LPC. So with that, I bet we're going to see something. Because folks are also finding other streams of business, publishing a journal and selling that journal. I'm trying to think, all kinds of examples I can tell you about. And so we're going to have to see where we get a legislative right on that. And we're also going to see what happens when we have a complaint case that really is about, was this counseling, was this coaching, can you take the hat off? And so I think that's what we're going to see that's going to come. But that's what I talk to everybody about. I try to have a dialogue about it, because we don't have absolutes. And for anybody that I speak with, that we do delve into the development of a separate coaching or consultation practice, I just continue to remind them, there's no way to guarantee that this would not be seen by someone to be the practice of, and could be a complaint somewhere. So that's what we talk about.
Are the coaches being held accountable for practicing without a license?
We don't have any legislation out there that, used to have a friend, she had a child, and he goes, I want a place where they have none rules. And this is an area where we have none rules. We don't have any. So, and we don't have, it's not like the council's enforcement capability, whatever, is to run and police unauthorized practice. Okay. We have that in law. We have the unauthorized practice of law, and there's a big committee, and then they try to enforce people who come and don't have a license here in Texas and are practicing or representing themselves as. But we really don't have that. We've got some laws on the books, but we don't have a big scheme to do that. And again, it's business is booming. And so there's a lot out there, and it's very difficult to police, even if we did have some of that legislation.
So if you're an LPC or an MFT and you're also a certified coach,
Mm-hmm.
how confident or excited would you be, for me as a therapist, but also a coach, to be seeing clients outside of state and just say, yeah, but that's just coaching? I mean, is that yeah, I don't know how to finish the question.
I know exactly what you're saying. So then that becomes the next thing. If it's not the licensed practice, and it is under the auspices of a separate certified coaching business, then it is also not subject to record keeping, and it's not healthcare per se, and it's not falling under all of the things that you're required to do as licensed practice. So similarly, we're seeing certified coaching done across state lines, and it will again be, does that other state or does Texas see that as, oh, you're actually doing therapy, you're just calling it coaching? And I don't know. It's going to be very different how you conduct that. I would certainly not want to see, if you can divide that line, I would not recommend that you have the same clients. You know, I think it is not that you don't have a therapy client that you also coach. Okay. Similarly, if you're in a coaching scenario, if you're in anything, I don't think it would be appropriate for you to then go, hey, why don't you come over here and see me for therapy, or your family, or and I think those are the tough ethical lines that my folks that are licensed and have a coaching are having to cross. Some things I think are easier to see. Similarly, we have a distinction between pastoral counseling and counseling. And we get a lot of questions and issues about that. Well, why is that? How can we separate that out? And why do you get to go over here and you don't have the same licensure and expertise that you have here? I believe that one of the things that is easier is when it's stuff that is more familiar. I think that it is more familiar to, for example, if you are a licensee and you are giving a continuing education presentation and you get paid to do that presentation. Well, that's pretty cut and dry, right? You haven't established a client therapy relationship, but that is a different business. Arguably, your license gives you credibility to offer that, but someone didn't necessarily have to have that license to give a continuing education course. So that's pretty easy. I think it gets trickier the closer it gets to something that feels like therapy. And again, that is just mushy. We're in mushy land in terms of what this looks like and what we're talking about. But courses that are offered, training that's going through a workbook, the more that things are done like that, that seems to be arguably more understandable as a separate and independent thing. But we'll keep having these conversations unless and until we get some guidance and regulation. But right now, we don't have any hard and fast lines on that. So any other questions about this arena before I talk about some of the big regulatory stuff that's gone on? Okay, well, I've got to spend one more Christmas this year, although it was not as bad as the GFE year. Kind of working up and getting on with new regulations. A couple of years ago, we had the No Surprises Act good faith estimate requirements. And this came about because we knew forever and ever and ever for our physicians and hospitals and other healthcare providers that we were going to have this big legislation that was aimed at eliminating surprise emergency room bills or getting a bill from an out-of-network anesthesiologist, but you had no idea because you were not in a place to argue about who was going to be your anesthesiologist, that kind of thing. And so that was great. We knew it was coming. We've known it forever. Texas has had its own little version of that were applicable to some providers. And so we all got caught off guard by this surprise addition between July and the end of September, the year before it went into effect, January 1, 2022, which was the good faith estimate that anybody who had a state license and was providing healthcare had to go through the different requirements. For this regulation, you have to, even though this is all pretty much applicable to my private practice folks who never wanted to take Medicare, Medicaid, insurance, anything at all anyway, who never wanted to interject themselves into the system, all of a sudden they've got a requirement. And that is to ask any and all, anybody who just calls and asks about fees, anybody who's a new client, anybody who is a current client, must be asked in the intake flow, hey, do you have insurance and do you intend to use it for paying for your therapy services? Yes.
Sorry, we have a question about the GFE. A lot of websites are putting it up as a generalized document. You happy with that, or does that not quite meet the requirement where you individually need to create one for each client, as opposed to just a general, here's a GFE on the website kind of thing that's just a rough estimate?
Awesome. I'm going to tell you exactly. So what the rule says, if you read it, it says that first you have to ask. That's literally a thing. So how am I going to prove that I asked? Well, you have to document it. So you've got to document in the record. Step one, do you have it? Are you using it? That's how we determine, first of all, if you are true private pay. In therapy world, we usually call private pay means you're paying me and you might get a super bill and go sort it out with the insurance company yourself. I, the practitioner, am not going to deal with that. But with the federal definition, it's you're not even going to use your super bill. No super bill, truly private pay. So step one, you've got to ask and you have to document that you did. Once someone says, yeah, I'm true private pay, that triggers the individual licensee responsibility to offer, and you may do this through the practice as you do administratively, but there must be a document provided to the individual in advance of the therapy appointment. For current clients, you just try to get it out to them as soon as you can. But the idea is, I want you to have this estimate without any pressure, not 10 minutes before we're going to start our therapy session, but where we have this arm's length transaction where you're able to look at and evaluate the cost of what therapy is going to look like. And that estimate needs to have certain ingredients in it. I spend a lot of time trying to work that through where it meets, because some of the ingredients on the form you may not have because you haven't gotten an NPI number, because you're not taking insurance or participating, and you don't have a Medicare P10. And so I try to help folks figure that out. But the idea is that it has to be given to them. And there's this whole, I wish they had done it like they do the informed consent. Informed consent has to be completed before you start therapy services. The good faith estimate is driven by when an appointment is made. If an appointment is made greater than 10 business days out, you have to give them the good faith estimate within 3 business days. If the appointment is less than 10 business days, you have to get it to them within 1 business day. And if you're able to work them in less than 3 business days, you've had an opening and you made a space for somebody, you just have to get it to them as soon as you can, but before that appointment. I think the intent of this legislation, if you get into the comments and you get into all of this regulation, is good. It was intended to do a good thing. The problem is they didn't get any stakeholder weigh-in at all when it comes to mental health professionals. Everything that came about in this legislation, the example there's like all these pages and pages of comments about this is what we meant when we were doing this rule. It's all about a knee surgery. Everything, that's the analogy over and over and over and over. And that makes sense for a knee surgery. I can kind of tell you ahead of time, here's what I think your preliminary diagnoses may be. Here are the codes we're probably going to use because we've done knee surgeries forever. So I can give you this estimate ahead of time, and you can go shop it, because that's what it's supposed to be. You're supposed to be empowered as a consumer to get a bunch of different prices for some different things, and then cost compare and decide, and then make a decision. Well, that's a very different notion. First of all, your first good faith estimate that you're getting, you're going to have to not fill in a lot of the diagnoses. Or you could, because you haven't seen this person, you have no idea what their needs are going to be. So it also becomes a 2-step process. You end up giving 2 estimates. You give that first estimate with a lot of TBD. You have to give it to them. You have to go over it verbally with them in that first session and document that you did. So it has to be maintained in the record. So you've got to document that you asked them to determine if they even needed one. And then you must document So it's a written and a verbal that you went over this with them. Okay. So that's where it's difficult. One of the confusions that I see is I see a number of folks that put GFE language on their website, and then that's it. They're like, well, I told them, and my fees are right there, and you can see it. And clearly, I mean, if they had asked me, I don't disagree. You all, in your informed consents, based on your Texas licensure rules, have so much disclosure already about your fees. You have a transparency, but that same transparency isn't everywhere. Like, I can't tell you various healthcare providers that I go to, I couldn't tell you what anything cost. I couldn't tell you.
I haven't received a GFE for any procedures
Right.
that I've had from the medical community.
Yes.
So if they're going to submit the super bill,
Uh-huh.
insurance reimbursement, does that mean they don't need a GFE?
They don't get a GFE.
Uh-oh.
But wait, there's more. There will be a GFE form, and I check every day, every other day, coming. There will be some form of GFE required for those clients who do use insurance, but it hasn't happened yet. And I'm watching because I want to be able I've got so many folks out there. As soon as that hits, I will send out the message to the world. Here's now what you need to do. But that's the distinction. The private pay thing has jammed a lot of people. It's like, no. I know we say private pay when people get a super bill and do it, but for the federal government's purposes, we're only talking about true cash pay, true private pay. Okay. And you have to give that estimate, and you've got to two-step it.
Mm-hmm.
So after you've had the opportunity to assess and you know what the diagnoses will be or the potential CPT codes, then you give them a second GFE. Okay, now we know what you got. You go over it with them again. You document it in the records. Okay, and it's a real thing. I keep watching the new things that they do. If you go to the website, there's a button to complain, and you upload your documents and you say, I didn't get one. It was inaccurate. There was a difference between what I was quoted and what I paid of $400 or more. Mm-hmm. And they've been making these great strides in these independent resolution. They've hired people all over the place. I know some of the people that are doing it for Texas to be the decision makers when there's a dispute between a patient and a healthcare provider. And so we've already seen some of those. There was already a lawsuit and a change in the requirements brought by the physicians. Texas and other organization already sued them over the whole independent dispute resolution thing. And so they've already modified that in some ways. But I'm with you. I haven't gotten one yet. But it's real and it's out there, and it does require, to answer your question, Brian, it's not just putting the notice. There's a prescribed notice with some language that has to be in there, that's got to be on there. They don't have a font size requirement, but I know, knowing that they're the same folks who police the HIPAA, it has to be searchable within your website. So when I'm talking to clients, I'll go on the website and I'll do the search thing. And if I don't find good faith estimate, then I'm like, hey, you got to have that in there. So you've got the two-step, you've got a verbal, you've got a record keeping, you've got a website notice. So those are the things. And then please tell me your question.
Oh, I just had a question. So we do our GFE at intake. We do it when we go over it with them in our first session. But then if you're 2 or 3 sessions in and they start asking for a super bill, we have to go back and document that.
If they ask for a super bill, then you stop. And that's okay. That's going to change. That means now they don't need the GFE, and you're going to document that. I know they didn't ask you.
They'll go back to private pay.
It's again, and when they had January 5th, right after that went in effect on January 1, there was a stakeholder meeting where people could meet and the feds were rolling it out. Mm-hmm. And the very first question was from an individual who's, hi, I'm here to speak on behalf of, and it was a national organization of mental health providers, asking about, hey, how do you do that if you don't have a diagnosis? And you could see because they were all there to launch this great thing and look what we're doing and we're eliminating great bills. And right off the bat, the mental health professionals are just throwing a little bit of bomb in it. And they're all just like, what? Because they really hadn't contemplated it. There's a letter that went out maybe a month after that everybody signed, the psychologists, the counselors, like all, there's 12 to 16 different organizations that all weighed in that said, hey, maybe don't you want to not do this? Don't you want to think about it? We didn't really get to weigh in. Don't you want to think about the implications? And the feds basically responded, thanks. We'll take that into consideration. That's kind of where we are. And that's where that is, but it is real. I even had colleagues, I had different people going, that's not a thing. That's not going to be a deal. It's a deal. It's just like when we got the new HIPAA deal. And then just like what we have, which is the newest Christmas gift, and that was the Medicare opt-out provisions.
Can I ask you one more question?
Ask me one more question, GFE.
Because I think that we are pretty good, right? Not perfect by any stretch, but certainly have a heart of compliance that we're showing. But we just resent our new
Sure.
GFEs for the new year.
Sure.
And that's all documented. But are you saying when that client comes in at the next session, we should talk about
Yes.
the new GFE
Yes.
and documenting it? Because
Yes.
that's something we're not
Yes.
doing. We're documenting what we're sending, what it is to the client in the portal, but we're not at the new year verbally going over that.
Once you get a new one, you need to verbally go over it. And then I'm going to try to put a little bit of a positive on it. It's not ever a bad idea to go over stuff with people at least once a year. Go back through the stuff you know they don't read in the informed consent. I will tell you, when people get really caught off guard will be about confidentiality. You will really spell it out in there about mandatory abuse reporting, about the exceptions to confidentiality. You will spell it out to parents who are not the client of a minor child. Hey, the minor child's the client. You have this right of access to their, you have a parental right, now subject to whatever custody orders have to say about that. But then anything that you tell me, parent, all the stuff that you email me and text me and call me about and stuff you give me, usually particularly in the context of some kind of child custody dispute, all of that stuff doesn't have an expectation of confidentiality. That all goes in your kid's record, and that is all part of that record. So let's think about that. It's all that to say it's not a bad idea to go through things like that. We have people who get upset when there's a mandatory abuse report made. Parents who are very upset about that. And it's like, hey, this is a state law requirement that I have. If I've got, reasonable cause to believe that there's been abuse or neglect, and I see observable or material adverse impairment or implications for the child, that's changed. That is a conversation for another day. We did have some recent changes to the family code just in the language of when and how to report. And I know for a fact right now, I could do an hour on just making those determinations because it's not easy for you all. I will tell you, when in doubt, just make a report. I know that's difficult because it does do some damage to the trust relationship, and the clinically can have an adverse impact, but you can't ever get in trouble for making a report, but you can for failure to do so within your 48-hour time frame. So the other thing that we got that is somewhat less complicated than the GFE, that's its positive, is this idea of the Medicare opt-out. Okay, just so you know, since 1998, we have had legislation that has permitted, particularly physicians who first did it, to privately contract with patients instead of taking Medicare. Okay, so the ability to do that, to not have to take Medicare, but instead to require someone to privately pay you, has been an ability that's been in effect since 1998. As psychologists and clinical social workers were added to the list of providers who could also opt out of taking Medicare, having to send in an affidavit to the government, even though you've never participated, never going to participate, never want to participate, has been a requirement for a number of years. So long time. What we haven't seen is a lot of enforcement in this arena. I really had never even encountered it. And then in the anticipation of January 1 of this year, adding LMFTs, and that's only going to be fully licensed ones per the definition of healthcare provider in the regulation, and the addition of LPCs, well, whoa, we have really expanded the number of providers. I mean, that's LPCs, that's huge. And so in doing now there's this enforcement of that requirement that each individual licensee send in that opt-out affidavit if they're not going to take Medicare and accept it. And I recommend that not only that you send that in, but that you also put language in your informed consent about it. And why not put a blurb where you've got the GFE, where you've got your fees? I mean, why not go ahead and do that? Because I had a practice last year where they had someone, unbeknownst to them, get their super bill, submit the super bill to Medicare, and then the practice gets a letter from CMS that says you have not opted out and you have charged more than we allow for covered services, and you must pay up. And they have the ability to not only have you refund the money to the client, but also to take enforcement action. That was not the case in this one. But I'm like, why have I never seen this before? And I believe it's because we've stepped up enforcement in anticipation of what's coming up at the beginning of the year.
Do associates need to submit the opt-out?
They do not. The definition of healthcare provider under the regs is that you have to have had 2 years or 3,000 hours. And so by definition, it's going to rule out the associates and the LPCs, which is kind of weird because we let our associates independently practice, well, not practice, take money for themselves, be self-employed. But no, you will not take those. And then the follow-up to this is when you are asking folks about the GFE, hey, do you have insurance and are you using it? That is also going to be the time where you ask, and when I'm asking about that, are you Medicare eligible? Is Medicare one of those that you have the ability? You want to be very deliberate and very cognizant about not getting into a basis because it could be disability as well as age. But once someone tells you, well, yes, I am Medicare eligible, doesn't matter if they're going to use it or not. If they are, then you give them a private contract. And that contract, I've modified one for use with mental health folks. It's basically, the regulations require it. It was part of the compromise of that 1998 law that said, okay, you can opt out, but here's what you have to do. You have to have a signed private contract with the patient or client that spells out some things and just lets them know, hey, they're not taking Medicare. You're going to have to pay for it. Your gap stuff's not going to cover it. I'm not opting out because I got kicked out of the program. I'm opting out because I'm just choosing to opt out. And it spells out very much. And then you keep that private contract with anybody that's Medicare eligible within the records, just like you do anything else. So that was a lot less scary than the GFE business. There's not all these days and business days and all this other stuff. For folks tell me, well, what happens if I don't opt out and something happens and somebody inadvertently, and I don't know, and somebody super bills Medicare? Well, what will happen is they treat you as a non-participating provider, which basically means you're an out-of-network provider. And so then they could not only have you pay back the money that if it was over what is allowed as a covered service, but that they could also assess a penalty. So that's kind of the latest. Beyond that, we're going to have the new HIPAA rule that has supposed to have been dropping for 2 years, really, really, really is supposed to drop this year. When we do, it's going to have some substantive changes. And it'll require new training. because it will change what some of the requirements. On a positive note, some of the things that will change are because the feds liked what Texas did so well. So they like 15 days instead of 30. So they want everybody to be 15 days. Now it may be 15 business days. So you all are still 15 calendar to get records to folks. But some of those changes, they literally say in the comments, Texas does this and we think it's awesome and we want to do it too. And so, or they like the end result of that. It gave faster access to people.
Can I
but-
ask you about a question? About that?
Sure.
It's a little off, but as far as when we're obtaining documents for clients, records for clients, I believe I remember a couple of years ago you suggesting, so we took it out of our informed consent language, not charging clients to obtain records. I was wondering if you would, because we have new people here on the team, if you would kind of go into that again as to why that's not maybe best practice, because a lot of people do that.
So one of the things that HIPAA has always allowed is for you to charge a reasonable fee for the cost of producing records. However, that can't include the search and retrieval time. It can't include the payment for the labor for the person who has to go. I mean, you think about that, you have entire records companies at hospitals. It's a very expensive business keeping, maintaining, and producing these records, okay? So for some time, we've had this issue of what is a reasonable fee. And then we had not really any guidance, except we had the Med Board come up with a rule. And the Med Board said, you know, the first so many pages is this much money, and then after that, you could charge so many cents a page, etc. Well, then we had electronic records. So then the Med Board changed that, and they said, well, here's what it is when it's for paper, here's what it is when it's electronic, and when the record's hybrid, and you have paper and electronic, here's what you can charge. So we rocked along, and then in 21, we had a case, Ciox sued Azar. It's a big healthcare providers and the U.S. Health and Human Services over this whole business, because one of the things that was happening is when you had primary plaintiffs' attorneys seeking records because they have a big car wreck, they have something that they need those records. They were charging enormous, healthcare providers were charging a lot of money to attorneys to get those records. So then we had all of this stuff back and forth. The feds were trying to say, no, you can't do that. The patient cost that we have determined is reasonable for a patient to get the patient's records for themselves is $6.50. Okay, that's the patient fee. And you can't charge more than that to anybody. Well, they had a big hubbub and they kind of like divided it in the middle. Okay. For some things, it's $6.60. For other things, you can charge. Do you see where I'm going with this? It's not worth it. It is not worth it. It's not worth it to go, well, these are $6.50, $6.60, whatever it's going up to. But these over here, but wait, was it a high-tech request? Because high-tech's different. And I can say that the attorney is my representative and I want them sent to my attorney electronically, and that falls within the patient allowable rate. I don't want you all to have to make all that decision making. And let's look at the optics. Hi, I just saw somebody's informed consent yesterday. $150 for records. That's what we've determined is a fair amount. And I'm not giving you records till the fee is paid. That doesn't feel good. That doesn't look right. I had a board case a few years ago, and somebody had tried to say that, and they got in a big dispute because the gal hadn't paid the fee, and the therapist just not going to give the records. And I was like, was it really worth that? Because the way it read, you were kind of holding somebody's civil right of access to their own information hostage for dollars. That's the difficulty that I see, which is why I typically say, just don't bother. It's not ever going to be worth that in the end, even though it is burdensome and it does take time.
Mm-hmm.
Electronic records have facilitated some of that, but that's why I say that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
So I'm gonna disconnect the video, but I want to give you a chance to say thank you or whatever.
Oh, I did. You know, I could just keep going. I'm so thrilled. I wish I could see all your faces. If you do have questions, you can find me. Happy to help or get you to the right resource. Thank you.